Okay. Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we're going to have, I don't think we can call this fun. I don't know what to call it. It will be interesting, though, I promise you that. We've got to talk about torture. I've got a friend here, a new friend, who's a professor who just recently retired from Carleton University, who specializes in human rights studies. It was in a program that Carleton runs on human rights. And one of the human rights is, I suppose, not to be tortured, but he has some expertise in that topic. The thing that immediately I wanted to know about was, how can you get people to do such a thing? So that's one of the things I want to explore with him. This is William Skidmore. Hello, Professor Skidmore.
Hello, Meta. You can call me Bill.
All right, we'll do that. So, hello, and let's get right down to work. I asked you to come and talk to us about torture because this is not a topic that I have ever covered before, and yet, everybody has to worry about the social psychology of, how do people become torturers?
Become torturers.
Yeah.
Well, there's not a single answer. It varies depending on the person, the circumstances, or whatever. I think one can go back and say, okay, what is torture? And there's a torture convention, severe pain or suffering of a physical or psychological nature. But part of what the torture convention also speaks about.
Excuse me, when we use the word convention in this sense, it means a treaty.
Right, the International Convention on Torture and Cruel, Inhuman, and Degrading Treatment or Punishment. So a UN treaty ratified by most states, many states.
When did that come into existence, by the way?
Oh, I think the official ratification, I think, was 1984. But there's reference to torture in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and others. And it's been long understanding since at least the Second World War, if not before, that torture is both a moral and a legal failing to engage in that. But so if I go back to this notion of the involvement of the state, and one can question if that definition is correct, but that's the one that's there. Torture, in a sense, is a crime of obedience. Often people think that the people who torture, let's say the soldiers, the police officers, are driven by a particular sadism, a personality that wants to cause suffering for other human beings. But in fact, that's usually not the case, or if it is, they need to constrain it because they are the upfront perpetrators of harm, but they're doing it on behalf of other authorities. So they have to be constrained, prepared to act in the interest of the state. For instance, don't kill the subject if the state doesn't want them killed, or whatever. You don't want to just give vent to sadistic impulses. And so often it's said torturers are like us, ordinary people who are become that. Now, after being a torturer, especially for any length of time, I think one loses the moral sensibility that one normally has, which is not to inflict pain on other people. Most of us don't in our day begin thinking, oh, how can I go and really hurt somebody in the deepest way? And torture is perhaps the most profound way of causing suffering because, and it's a little more complex than this, but unlike killing, you prolong the suffering. You maintain it. You gradually destroy the person's sense of self. You make them into such a desperate person who will do anything to get out of the pain, who watches themselves as normally a proud, self-confident person, perhaps, begging, crying, defecating, urinating on themselves, begging, feeling totally unable to control their circumstances. That is the pain that is caused. So part of what, I'm not really answering your question at this moment.
No, you are. You really are, because that, you're giving a very full explanation of what that kind of experience is like. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and partly what draws me to teaching about political repression, and torture is part of that, it's not the whole
Mhm.
element, is the suffering it causes, the unbelievable suffering, and it's suffering that doesn't stop when the torture stops. It remains with the person throughout their life, whether those are in terms of the physical consequences, um, muscular, skeletal problems, headaches, insomnia. I have a friend here who was tortured, an engineer. He can't do math anymore in his head.
You
You
can't
know,
do
the mathematics, an engineer. You
yeah.
know, so cognitive harms, and then psychological harms of anxiety, of depression, um, of losing faith and trust. I mean, this is one of the greatest shames. And the same person, but I've heard others speak of this as well in his case. He was blindfolded, brought into a certain office. He thought he'd be able to just explain things. He wasn't that worried. And out of the blue, without him seeing it, came a slap, a horrible slap on his face. So he lost, he said, my understanding of life changed at that moment. And other torture survivors say that as well when they were the first instance of the humiliation, of the pain, of the total control exercised over them, to imagine that another human being could be treating them like this.
Hmm.
So it has long-term effects, destroying trust,
Yes.
the inability to be close to others, even the inability to be close to one's spouse or one's children or one's friends. So it's horrific what it does. But again, my interest in it wasn't simply, and this was part of it, because I'd met people through my work before academia who had been tortured and talked to them to some degree. And of course, I'd read about it. But this incredible damage that is done and lasts a lifetime. But it's done for a reason, for a state reason, usually. A very simple, simplistic notion would be that it targets those who dare to challenge the power of the state, to stop political activity, to stop those who would challenge the state's activities.
Hmm.
And it's not just in dictatorships, it's in democracies as well. It's as even the now deceased Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano once said, and I don't remember the exact quote, it was very powerful, but he said, you know, the torture and the torture chambers, these are the consequences of inequalities of wealth, of the powerful wanting to maintain their wealth, their status, their power. And this is what it comes down to.
That's one. How did you get into this?
It probably started in my early 20s when I moved to Ottawa. I'm from Saskatoon. And I had worked there in a crisis center, so I was familiar with individual personal life traumas from people who I meet through my work, suicidal, depressive, victims of spousal abuse, whatever,
Mhm.
really horrific stuff. But then I got more involved around the political side. And part of that, when I came to Ottawa, I did my master's in social work, and I met people who were from different countries, Central America, Chile. At the time, this was in the late 70s, early 1980s. So we have different waves of refugees coming to Canada, depending on the circumstances of that time. And some of them would talk about it. It's rare, and you don't go and ask somebody, "Hey, were you tortured?" It's just in my, how old was I? I guess I was 30, 31. I moved to Zambia in southern Africa to work with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees.
Oh,
I'm not a legal person, so I wasn't doing the protection elements of uh, according refugee status, finding third countries such as Canada to immigrate to. I was on more the social service, small business creation side of it for people who would be remaining there. But through that work, of course, either people would tell me or I would become familiar with certain cases of people who had come to the UN who would describe their treatment, some of it quite horrific. And
and
then
they
also,
always bring it up, or do they avoid it mostly?
I don't know how the lawyers, if they ask right out, I have a feeling often they need to build the case. They
Right.
probably do that. I wouldn't. People would confide in me, tell me. um, you know, it's like, I guess, a comparison would be, you don't ask somebody, were you sexually assaulted? Do that. You allow somebody if they wish, and then
Mhm.
you have to decide how to deal with it. And also, besides that, so this was in the early 19, no, 85 to 88, I was there. And it was also the time of the apartheid struggle in South Africa and Namibia. And it impacted what they called the frontline states, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Angola, Botswana. And so I would meet members of the African National Congress, and sometimes they would tell me something about this, or at meetings, people would talk. So it was just gradually I became more aware of the depth of, of the violence used to suppress people and the long-term impacts. And, even at the time, I wouldn't necessarily understand it well. It's over time, I often think of this one guy who used to irritate me, an ANC member. And the reason he irritated me, it was only this one thing. Every hour on the hour, he stopped all conversation, if you were at a party or with a group talking, and put the news on. He was obsessed at learning what was happening at home, if any news. And so there was such an attentiveness to that. I don't know if he was ever tortured, but he was in exile. He obviously had to flee his country. He'd been subjected to all sorts of harms to take that. And at that time, I didn't realize that that was one of his coping techniques. I learned that more later as I more studied the research on torture. So that's a long answer to
Mhm. Mhm.
why I came to it.
Mhm.
But I do, as a teacher, I wanted to, when I talk about human rights violations, let's say even economic and social and cultural rights violations, say, okay, what role does force, intimidation, coercion, and the infliction of deep pain ultimately playing on maintaining social and political obedience? Don't challenge the system or you will pay a price.
I've heard people say that it is counterproductive. That they were talking a few years ago about waterboarding in the U.S., which is torture of I
Oh,
guess.
it's absolutely
Yeah,
torture.
yeah.
Absolutely torture.
And there was a debate, I guess, as to whether or not you were actually going to get the truth out of people with that. Now, how often is torture used as a means of extracting information from people who might be otherwise, in on a secret that they don't want to share, political
Well,
conspiracy or something?
well, they commonly seek information. The question becomes how genuine that information is if people tell you it under extreme duress that we're, like I say, we will say whatever to save ourselves from the pain. Sometimes people try to commit suicide while they're in prison and being tortured because it's so horrific. So gather information to punish. It's a way of saying if you dare speak out, you will suffer the most incredible pains. It's to create collaborators, those who
Mhm.
will,
I thought of that.
in order to end the pain, and then you create a large society of collaborators. Um, it's there's, I guess, essentially, and I think I said it earlier, its primary role is to deter challenging authority. It's to deter political activity. But back
Yeah,
to the
but
question,
that's a big category because now you've already, these are two different things. Getting collaborators is one thing,
yeah,
punishing people and making
yes.
an example of them as a warning, um, and then extracting information from. Now, those would seem to be all three, and maybe there are other types of or motivations for it, but
Yeah.
although they're all a matter of trying to get conformity with the government.
Yes, that's the overarching
Different.
reason.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Or
yeah.
even to change how a person thinks politically, to to get them to betray their cause and actually identify, not just doing it so the pain stops, but
Mhm.
that they then fully identify with the cause of their oppressors.
Now,
So that,
does that happen much?
I don't know how much that happens. I can't give you stats. And even if you look at different research on, and going back to your first question, how do you get people to do this? There's a lot of difference of understanding based on research of what are the factors that lead people to actually
Well,
becoming
I
tortured.
remember during the Patty Hearst case, there was a story about the Stockholm syndrome, that
Right.
she was moved over to becoming one of the kidnapper group, joined the group, the Symbionese Liberation Army or
There's
something
another.
like that.
Right.
But I don't think she was ever tortured. I think that this was a case in which her psychological strength was just not strong enough, and she joined the cause.
Right.
That is, but the idea that you would torture somebody and actually get them to want to be part of your outfit, ooh, that's a
But
hard one.
but if you look at, again, the causes or bringing people to torture, and there's many different, and this isn't one I would start with, but it, I think, responds to your question a bit. One way of making people torture is in a systematic way for a state, a government. After you've selected those who will do it, they become part of a professional unit that's set to do it. Usually, to varying degrees, they themselves are degraded, are humiliated, even tortured. And so the notion is, you would think they would then never want to do that to anybody, but often they actually identify so much ultimately with those who are abusing them because they're so dependent on them,
Oh,
amongst other reasons. So a learned helplessness of, they become extremely loyal to them. They have been brutalized themselves, initially hating or the treatment of themselves, but then they identify with those who did it to them and then become part of the group who does it to others. And I think at a what's another word here? A smaller, lighter level. I don't want to compare the two exactly, but even initiation rituals for fraternities, let's say.
that's
They,
yeah. I mean, I've never understood that, but yes, they certainly do go along with it, don't they? That's part hazing. Yeah, yeah,
hazing, right.
yeah.
You degrade the person,
Mhm.
you make them feel lesser, you destroy their own identity, their sense of self-confidence, of their own beliefs. You break them down and you build them up again. I mean, military training does that to some degree, and it can be done more severely. But this is what you're doing. You're destroying that person's capacity for agency to act on their own moral beliefs and brutalizing them. And then they join and are so connected to the authority that did it. And that's the most important thing, because you want torturers who will obey orders. You don't want freelancers. You don't want those who will do something that will harm what you're trying to do. They have to be completely obedient to those who control them without question. And
Well,
so,
I was waiting to bring that up because even before we met today, I was thinking about Dave Grossman's work. Dave Grossman is a lieutenant colonel or something, retired from the U.S. Army, where he was. I don't know what his own role was, but he certainly was a military instructor. And what he argues, and he's got really good evidence, that people inherently will avoid killing, and that in previous wars, most of the people who were supposed to be shooting at each other would often deliberately miss, even though it would expose them to harm because the other guy could shoot them back, but they didn't want to kill, so they would shoot over their head or in the ground or someplace. And they've done things like collect spent bullets after a battle and compared to how many people actually got hit, and of course it's a fraction of the number of people who could have been hit if they were trying to shoot straight. So he says that people inherently will avoid being inflicting pain or killing another person, but the Army then has to overcome that. So they've done some very creative things. They've developed, like video game trainings, and they've done various things to make people shoot at targets that look human first, and they work up their way up to overcome this resistance. And recent wars, he says, have shown that they're much more successful nowadays in recruiting any ordinary young man, I guess a woman too, to do this and overcoming their reluctance. They might even start with having them kill a chicken. I've never killed a chicken, although I've watched my mother do it. And you start with doing something that you would sort of be repelled by doing, and then work your way up to horrible things. So I suppose that becoming a torturer would be like the last stage in this learning process, this educational process, redefining of the personality.
Well, Dave Grossman, his basic thesis was the further away you are from your victim, the easier it is to inflict harm on them. So if you're launching a missile or you're in a bomber at 40,000 feet, it's easier to press the button than if you have to do it up close. And then torture, of course, is even a step closer because you're not killing normally. That can be at the end, but you're actually, as I said earlier, keeping them alive in such a degraded state. And it is interesting what you said about the chicken. Gosh, in my early 20s, I lived in India and I worked with a guy who had been in the Indian military, and he told me that they would practice bayoneting on dogs as an example of how to do it. And then there's various rituals of that people are put through these horrors do, like even being given the blood of animals to drink as a ritual, because who would be inclined? So these are unifying rituals as well. These are your comrades, you've done this. So, but there are these antecedent conditions besides the training, the notion of course, you create the sense often of certain persons in a society being either inferior or a danger, and often both. So the famous example of what the Nazis did to Jews in Roma and others, before the Nazis came along, these groups of people were already devalued, already seen as a threat, already seen as harming the society. So it could be you look down on people because of their ethnicity, their religion, but could also be their political views. So they pose a threat. And so you develop this in-group, out-group. They are the threat. We are saving the country from them. You become part of even truly a notion of a professional network within the military of one's country who does this. And you see what you're doing as an important job for the state, and you view your comrades as doing an important job, doing it capably, and you look down upon those who you torture. And the more you torture them, the more you look down upon them, because of course they're looking in a horrible state. It's like how we often will pass poor people or people begging for money and look down on them even without wanting to do that and think, oh, they're ragged and dirty. And we also have this just world thinking that, well, I'm fine. Well, why aren't they? It's their fault. So we even look at the tortured person, it's their fault they're in this predicament because it's a just world. One wants to believe that. That's how if we are doing well, we like to say it's because the world will reward people who work hard and have whatever characteristics we think matter. So we see people being tortured or otherwise think they deserved it, they've done something wrong, they're a threat, and look at them anyway. What a pathetic piece of garbage sitting in front of me. Even though one has done the degrading of them themselves, they still look down on them.
So interesting. Now, we've got to the point of talking about the after effects. You've begun by saying that they're broken permanently. Is everybody broken permanently, or do you know of cases of people who somehow have overcome the trauma in a way that they do not have nightmares or whatever other horrible lasting effects?
Well, yes. I mean, I've known people who have impressed me so much by what they've had to deal with. Let's say it's a permanent state. You'll always remember it. It'll always affect you in some way. Um, People grapple with it to greater degrees depending on their circumstances, the supports they get. just their basic life circumstances. Some people think, some therapists think, yeah, you have to work it through. Others would say no. For instance, imagine somebody who's been tortured, arrives in Canada as a refugee, they have a family, they have, they have to learn English or French, they have to find housing, they have to try and find a job, they have to recreate a whole life. So often the traumas they experienced, whether through torture or other traumas of fear, of being persecuted, or just the traumas of going into exile. So often those have to be pushed aside in order to just deal with the practicalities of daily life and also find meaning in that, especially if one, again, has others who depend on them. Now, some people might think, well, but maybe 20 years down the road when life is a little more stable, maybe it will come back to affect them. So there's varying theories of whether you actually indeed have to work it through. There's different understandings depending where people come from of what causes this pain. How do you go to a therapist? That's not a common notion in many cultures. Do you even talk about it to anybody? Especially imagining certain tortures like sexual torture, which is, we even know here with rape survivors how many feel so ashamed, and torture survivors feel the same. They didn't do any wrong, but
Mm-hmm.
they're made to feel something so deficient in them.
Mm-hmm.
And then you add in on top of other non-sexual tortures, the sexual tortures, it can complicate that. I, so I'm not sure what the answer, because I've known people who have so impressed me of, even with their own traumas, how I can describe it as a generous spirit, a caring for others, of maintaining their political goals and organizing. On the other hand, I want to be careful about turning them into heroes, because I think it puts a pressure on them that they don't always feel they can live up to.
Do you find anybody who can actually think of empathizing with and understanding or feeling, well, I don't like the word forgiveness in this context, but um, trying to understand the mentality of the torturer? I've heard of people who, 20 years later, they run into their torturer in a social situation, and there are stories about what happens in their encounter. I guess it varies a lot. But are there people who can feel any common humanity between themselves, either from the part of the torturer toward the victim, or vice versa?
Well, some torturers have, some have acknowledged what they've done, have confessed to it, have recognized just how much they dehumanized, or examples of maybe the torturer actually knew the person, they were a family friend or something. So there they can, it's harder to dehumanize the victim when you also know them in another way. I've read of cases of people who were, and good point you make. I have known people here, uh, for instance, on a busy downtown Ottawa street. They didn't tell me directly, a third person did, who's from the same country, because they've never talked to me about their torture, but I've heard about it, and it was horrific, from this third person. And they said they ran into their torture on a busy downtown street in Ottawa, who'd somehow gotten to become a Canadian citizen. And it's shocking and it's frightening, and it's terrifying, and it reminds you of the degradation. I have read of people who have tried to forgive, who have said, and there's different attitudes, some religious attitudes. I once had a student in class, and he said in his faith, we do forgive. And I said, well, is that just, a rationalization, like a psychological way of dealing with the pain? He said, no, we actually truly believe in that. And he was a very authentic guy, so I can see it. I've seen people try to do that. I've seen others who, for instance, say, my by treating them well was my best revenge.
Well,
I,
revenge, yes, but I have a dear friend with whom I have an ongoing debate. Let's call it that. But she is a spiritual person, Christian, who believes that the most important thing in life is to be able to forgive everybody all the time, unconditionally, no matter what they've done. And I think, no, At some level, you could do that if you think the other person was not was in a position where they either didn't know it better, like she talks about Christ on the cross, talking to the about forgive them because they know not what they do. Well, I think
Mhm.
the reason he says because they know not what they do is that's the only circumstance under which you could forgive somebody. Either they really didn't know better, or they're too young or too mentally incompetent, or something like that, so you can forgive them for being unable to understand. Or in a situation of duress, you might say you can forgive them because the circumstances were such that they had no effective choice. So there are conditions under which you can forgive, but I think if you, for the most part, the real responsibility we have is to require that others apologize and feel remorse before forgiving them. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a duty not to forgive until we've seen in the other person a real repentance and a remorse.
Yeah. I don't think there can be genuine reconciliation without acknowledgement of responsibility and
Uh-huh.
awareness of the harm that was done. And then if one determines it's a genuine remorse, because sometimes people express remorse to get out of hot water. It's not necessarily,
If
um,
it's fake, but
that's right.
I would think one would need to really sense that the other person really was hurting for about having done it.
Yeah, and maybe even over a period of time to see how genuine it is, and it's not just
Right.
play acting.
Mhm.
Um, I
And by the
sometimes,
way, I was reading, watching a video of a woman who was specialist in early Christianity. It's called patristics. It's a branch of theology, I guess, where they look at the early church. And apparently, the early church fathers also required repentance before forgiveness. They did not go around telling you forgive everybody no matter what. That
yes.
to me, that's that's kind of an important point to
And
acknowledge.
maybe there's a continuum in some ways. Like there's people who are psychotic and do horrible things. I'm willing, obviously, to say that they didn't know what they were doing, but that's not the norm. And but are there different levels? Even for instance, the frontline torturer who maybe says, if I don't torture, I will be tortured, I will be killed. They're in tough circumstances. And yet one would say, well, you shouldn't do it anyway. You're doing to somebody what they would do to you. But then they could say, well, yeah, well, if you don't torture, we won't torture you. We'll torture your children. There's so many ways to coerce people and put them in these most horrific dilemmas. Who I often feel greater anger to are the officials, are those who give the orders, of those on whose behalf they're acting. I'll give you an example. I remember George Bush when he was George W. The second, and there was something came up about maybe it was the Iraq War. I don't know if it was the Iraq War, Guantanamo, or whatever. I don't remember the context. But he said, "I sleep fine at night," and I thought, "Oh yeah, I guess you do." What about the people, the soldiers that either are living in fear of their own lives or after they've done horrible things to other human beings, they have to live with that reality for their entire life, where you don't have to because you just gave the orders and your hands are clean.
Mhm,
They're the folks that I just have
mhm.
the greatest derision for because they let others do it on their behalf and carry that burden.
Well, you could say that for every war maker, everybody, every general, everybody who even pays taxes that they know is going to be support military. Where complicity with warfare is so much a part of everyday life that it's a gradient scale. I'm sorry to say, you
Yes,
know, it's
yes.
real. I mean, it's not many people devote their entire existence to opposing being involved with a system that does harm to other people. That's all there is to it.
Well, we often expect that that should be what the citizens of an enemy state do. For instance, We talk about the good German, referring to the Germans during the Nazi era who pretended not to know, or if they did know, they didn't do anything. And I think, well, they lived under a totalitarian state where for them to resist carried severe consequences. I'm not justifying what they did, but even those who, and some resisted, there was a German resistance. It wasn't huge, I think, like the French or Polish resistance, other countries, but they were, you know, at least there was an element of fear. It's fascinating to me when persons who really don't have a whole lot to fear still remain bystanders. They still accept the state doing horrible wrongs, whatever they are. Even and now we live in a time where the information is so accessible to us. We can find good studies on different issues, academic, journalistic, whatever, and still some people prefer to remain just uninvolved.
Yeah, but I mean, look, this is, we're really talking about more than just torture now. We're talking about all kinds of political decision making about where what's right and what's wrong. I mean, the Republicans in the U.S. right today are not going to vote for the conviction of Trump for the impeachment because there's political gain to be had from being okay, and then they try to find an argument. I mean, now we're into the quicksand, or the weeds, talking about more morality, much more generally than the question of torture. I want to go back to an earlier assumption or assertion you made that it's always about trying to get the state to get people to conform to and obey the state. Because, there's other kinds of authority. And if you think about the Milgram experiment, where it wasn't the state, but it was a guy with a lab coat who looks authoritative. So you say, this is Professor so-and-so of the psych department, and he's a leading authority on this or that. And if he tells you to do something, of course you will do it because you want to be a cooperative, good citizen. So this isn't political, but it is certainly obedience. On the other hand, there's even more than that. There's not authority, but wanting to be approved of by one's peers. So being party to a particular group can lead a person to make judgment errors or to hide the truth about their perception. I mean, think of the Solomon Asch studies back, 50, 60 years ago, when Solomon Asch would get 6 or 8 people in a row, and they were all stooges. And then the 6th or the 7th person or so would be the real subject. So he would draw 2 lines and he'd say, which is longer, this one or this one? Right. And all 6 of them would give the wrong answer. And then when you get to the final one, the final person who's the real person will also give the wrong answer, because anybody could see how long this line is, but in order to not be considered deviant, they go along with this ridiculous thing. Well, so much of human interaction is a reflection of that kind of conformity, or the desire to be approved of. And it's not political. It's more like, I just want to be regarded as a good person.
Right.
Normal.
I remember those. I was in one of those experiments.
Were you?
Yes, when I was doing my undergraduate degree, and I actually said what I thought. I didn't go along with the others. But I know I've seen it in other cases too. For instance, working in organizations, and you're in a meeting and somebody's going on and on about something, you don't understand it and it's confusing, but you don't say anything because you think you're the only one. And then after the meeting, you start talking to people and you realize nobody understood it either, but we don't want to appear foolish. There is an interesting thing, I mean, with Milgram, and in some dispute whether and it's been tested with various variables, but basically obeying an authority. And as you said, the lab coat, Milgram himself was at Yale, so that carries prestige, etc. But it was been replicated all over. You're obeying an authority to a point that you would do great harm. That's the other thing. It wasn't just a minor thing.
Yeah.
Some,
They thought the other person had been, they could hear them screaming in the other room, and they thought they'd
right.
maybe even killed the person.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it would show on the meter, they read, danger, all that. Some though who look at again these antecedent conditions, indoctrination in a society, a belief of in-groups, out-groups, the threats. They also look at those who perhaps have either had more of an authoritarian upbringing or for whatever reason tend to have a greater belief in authority, a willingness to obey rather than to challenge
Mm-hmm.
authority. And I know I used to have a button a friend gave me, and I think it wrote on it, it said challenge authority. At least question it. But there's, whether it's fear, whether it's a belief in authority because authority will make the world work, right? For instance, one of the strongest reasons people justify either what they do or accepting, like in the case of William Calley in Vietnam with
Mm-hmm.
the My Lai massacre, I think the strongest reason given for those who thought he shouldn't have been punished is he was obeying orders.
Mm-hmm.
And that loyalty to your superior in the military or whatever authority was a higher value than not harming others.
Yeah.
So a lot of people carry that as a belief. And I even recall a case years ago, well, not that many years ago, with some people who left the US military after the Iraq invasion and sought refuge in Canada, exile in Canada. And a lawyer for the federal government, when these folks were claiming, um, I don't want to commit war crimes. So we're being forced to commit war crimes. And a lawyer for the Canadian government who was denying them their claim of refugee status here said, you're a low-level soldier. You don't have to make those decisions. Therefore, there's no reason to give you status. Where these were moral beings still who did not want to create harm. A lot of them say, I joined the military thinking I was going to be defending my country, saving us, and here I am now killing Iraqi civilians.
I'm not surprised that the person in authority would go along with that argument. I mean, wouldn't it historically have been considered a reasonable defense that you could say I was ordered to do it, and that would be good enough. I think, and maybe until maybe the war crimes tribunals after World War II, this really was discussed, and it was established that it's not a defense. But it's sure is a pervasive assumption, and even today, I think there are all kinds of people would assume that it is not only true, but it's a good argument. That's all you have to say is I was ordered.
Yeah, I think since the Second World War with the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and their additional protocols and that, yes, it became quite universal. You are not to obey an illegal order. Before that, though, there were different armies had their own codes of conduct. Some would sometimes say, no, you shouldn't obey an illegal order, an unlawful order, rather, is probably the terminology. And others would say you have to do it. But again, then there's the reality when you're in the heat of battle and you're ordered to do it. And if you don't do it, it could be done to you or you will be abandoned by your comrades. You're left with a sudden, difficult circumstance. Plus, you've also, in that heat of battle, developed hatred for the enemy. You've seen what they've killed your friends in uniform, and it gets very jumbled up into psychologically at the moment. Even there again, if you look at Vietnam, I mean, the soldiers were trained to degrade the enemy. It made it easier for them to say, I have to obey these orders because look at who we're dealing with here. Yeah. These beasts. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think your course is something, sounds like everybody in the world should be exposed to a lecture like, covering the things that we've been discussing.
Well, I created courses that I thought were important, and most of mine focused on political violence within human rights. That was my own strongest interest. I think it matters for many reasons that we understand even that societies ultimately operate through coercion. You may some coercion is legitimate, like, to force the person to attend their trial in court or who's accused of a crime, whatever, that kind. But I do think we need to understand the violence that underlies a lot of what we just see as economic issues. Some students have had that own experience in their own lives of family members tortured, perhaps even them. I did have a student who also was a guest speaker. He had been tortured badly and severely, but he wanted to talk about it. I'd never just asked somebody to do it. It was more, it came to my attention that they would speak, or they came to speak about a more general situation and then talked about their torture as well. But I, of course, like I said at the outset, very careful about their own state of mind.
Yeah.
And yes, I tell the students, this is very hard stuff. You're going to be upset. And I would have, I talk about that, how to deal with what you encounter. Some of it you may not be able to sit through. I had a student once, and I won't give any details about them, but they had come from an area we call a war zone, an area of conflict, intense conflict. They couldn't bear the sight of blood.
Oh.
But they could bear the sight of skulls. I mean, I once showed a video on Rwanda, and it's a famous scene from a church where all these skulls were piled up, and the students said, well, I can handle that, but blood I can't. In their own personal lives, not in a political context, but in personal abuse, sexual assault, whatever, they would be sensitive to that. So I try to work around it, but I think mostly, what I heard from people was they were glad to be informed of. They'd often say, I had no idea about this kind of stuff.
Really?
I had no idea. And they also, on evaluations, I assume when you were teaching, the student evaluations, the number one best thing, I got it every year because I'd have a lot of guest speakers, and they really appreciated hearing their story. And I asked my guest speakers, said, don't try and be academic. I do the academic side. Tell the stories, and the stories are profound. I feel emotional, and I can remember students feeling very emotional, but they didn't want to not know. They did, and there are victims, and they are also survivors. Yeah. They are people. The people you see here have been acting and still speaking out about what was done to them and others. We're able, but I was also trying to be understanding. If you can't listen to this, leave. Or I would warn in a film, if something coming up, I'll tell you, close your eye. You want to be sensitive and know they all have their own different backgrounds too.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this. This is really very, very meaningful. I hope we get a lot of people watching it, because I think everybody needs to go through a little of this. And just as you said, we all need to know.
Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed talking to you.
Well, I'll probably get back to you and talk about other aspects of human rights, because there's so much there.
I'd be glad to do that.
Oh, terrific. Bye-bye. Okay.